When the call came, I was folding a sweater at my kitchen table, and the light in the room looked like winter pressed between the panes, thin and patient. The voice on the line was careful in that particular way strangers become when they are about to rearrange the contours of your life. There was an incident. My father's heart had stopped in his chair at the farmhouse. No fuss, no breaking glass, no cinematic collapse. Just a closed mouth and the plain, hard work of the dead filling the room behind him. He was 78 and had never liked hospitals. He left me a single, precise instruction in one of his last letters. Trust what I leave you. Go to Alder Hollow. That was the first of many contradictions. If this story sounds like the sort of thing you want to sit with until the end, I'd be grateful if you stayed, subscribed, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled a will that read like a test. Stay until the last frame. There are pieces of my father's plan that don't make sense until the last reveal. My father used to call me Eve, as if the name were a small private joke, a gardener kneeling at the edge of the world. He kept his jokes and his grievances on shelves like heirloom jars. I grew up with the smell of coffee and oilskins and the hum of his radio late into the night. We were never a sentimental household. Affection lived in practical things: repaired harnesses, a picked-over blackberry patch, clear ledgers that balanced on a thin trust. He taught me to read with a battered copy of Middlemarch and to stand my ground in small-town meetings where men with louder voices tried to rewrite the rules. The will should have been straightforward enough. He left me the farmhouse and surrounding acreage at Alder Hollow. He left instructions for horses to be tended and his library cataloged. Then, in a clause that made my breath go thin, he divided half of the mineral rights and any commercial revenues into a trust, half to me, half to a man I had not spoken to in years, Robert Hale. Robert was the sort of man who wore his alliances like armor. He'd been my father's neighbor and, for decades, his rival across acres and auctions. They'd traded barbs over property lines and who had the better herd, but beneath the spats there had been old arrangements and a ledger of shared investments. Robert had always been practical, precise, and enormously quietly stubborn. To my father, perhaps he was the only man with the patience to counterbalance whatever stubbornness I carried. To me, he was the enemy who'd once tried to buy out my late husband's stables and had sent his lawyers to towns my family loved. The will read like provocation, half to my enemy. When I read those words, the farmhouse seemed to tilt. The key that had been placed in the wax-sealed envelope the lawyer gave me felt heavier than it should. A small, cold artifact that unlocked more than a door. The envelope also contained a name that threaded through the instructions: play them in order. Beneath the formalities, my father's handwriting had scrawled a single line in his iron hand: for when you are ready, Eve. The decision to go to Alder Hollow was not a decision at all. It was the only door that remained. The town had been waiting like a held breath, its streets narrow as gutters, the church spire a stern finger against the sky. The farmhouse looked the same as it had in photographs I had taken when I visited as a child. Wide porch, a great room with a stone hearth, the maple out front that still bore my name carved into it from some decade when we believed names were enough to hold someone safe. Inside, the house smelt like paper and horses, and something else: old varnish on a bookcase, the ghost smell of oil lamps. He had restored everything to meticulous order, as if he had been preparing the place for me. There was a laptop on the kitchen island with a small faded sticker in the corner, a fox in mid-leap. The screen lit when I touched the trackpad, and a single folder sat at the center of the desktop: Alder Hollow, for Eve, do not open until you are there. The files were dated in a way that was almost ceremonial. E01, why the farm? E02, a warning, each with a timestamp like a breadcrumb trail. He had recorded these in the months before he died. Later, when I found the neat pile of labeled USB drives in a locked desk drawer, my fingers trembled reading the dates, the ink still faint where maybe he had handled them too often. The first video was nothing theatrical. He sat in his leather chair against the big window in his study, light pooling along his cheekbones, as if he were carved in quiet. He greeted me like he'd been waiting. "If you're watching this, then I'm already a difficult thing that has happened," he said, and his voice, which I'd known my whole life, carried a mixture of apology and a stone-cold clarity that made the ache pinch the back of my throat. Each recording was a map, part emotional reckoning, part civil engineer's manual. He spoke about soil samples and elevation lines as if they were pages of poetry. He told small stories, how he had found a vein of shale near the northern ridge when he was 30, the way it had glittered, the quiet decision he'd made to keep that knowledge between a few people. He explained that he had spent the last decade balancing on a ledge he never wanted me to see, an arrangement with an energy company, a succession of contracts and silent cameras that left the farm both more valuable and more vulnerable. He was candid about his health, which made the recordings ache with a different weight. He had come to terms with the rhythm of his heart. The tests, he said, had been careful and consenting. There were shorter clips where he simply told stories, laughing at an old dog or remembering my mother. There were clips where his voice trembled, not from fear, but from the deliberation of someone distributing future burdens and gifts. But the files were not just memories, they were instructions. He had anticipated the predictable agitation of my uncles, the arrival of lawyers who spoke smooth and fast, and the public appetite for scandal. He had anticipated the possibility of me backing down, not because I would be unable to prevail legally, but because grief can become a quiet eraser of one's will. "Do not sell the farm," he told me in one clip, eyes on the camera like a man briefing a field officer. "You must know not only what is under the ground, but who stands above it and why." It was Ellis who finally stopped me from panicking. He had been the caretaker at Alder Hollow for nearly 20 years, and his presence was a constant, the way an old clock is a constant, familiar, occasionally imperious, and impossibly steady. He met me in the barn, and the smell of hay and oil wrapped around me like a shawl. "You got his videos?" Ellis asked. He didn't look surprised. He seemed to have expected every eventuality. He had a way of cleaning his hands on his jeans and of smiling like some private joke had been told just then. "He's left more than a will, Miss Eve. He left a plan." Ellis led me to the west wing of the barn, where a loose board lay over a seam in the floor. The board lifted with a groan, and underneath was a metal hatch with a wheel lock. The key in my pocket felt suddenly of prophetic significance. The hatch opened on a spiral of concrete steps that smelt faintly of damp earth and old coffee. At the bottom, the air was cool. The space opened into a concrete room, walls lined with maps, drawers like teeth, a long table with a projector at the far end, and a bank of filing cabinets stamped with dates and places. There were trays of soil samples in neat rows, labeled in my father's handwriting. There were horizontal sections of core samples displayed like pale fossils, mineral counts recorded in tidy columns. In one cabinet, I found letters, email printouts, hand-annotated surveys, and, most importantly, a set of notarized documents showing payments and trust agreements that traced back 20 years. One folder contained correspondence between my father and a man from Western Plains Energy, a corporation that had quietly bought up leases and options across the county. Another folder held a memorandum of intent in which Robert had been listed as a partner in an unnamed venture. It was the stacking of these documents that made the plan seem less like vengeance and more like strategy. My father had not simply appointed Robert as a beneficiary to spite me. He had created a structure that required cooperation to function. Half to me, half to Robert, split not as a spiteful division, but as a forced accountability. If Robert wanted access to the revenues, he would have to agree to terms my father had already set, terms that foregrounded environmental stewardship and community redevelopment. My father had known how to make greed procedural. The first meeting with the brothers was formal in the way feuds become formal when they reach a courthouse room. They arrived in suits that fit too neatly for men used to work boots. Robert with his clinical patience, Alan with a lawyer's easy tension, David with a slump that suggested he'd been carrying shame like a winter coat. Their statements were punctual and precise. Alan read aloud the clause that, in legalese, likened my father's bequest to a discretionary trust and insisted that half the rights were subject to a claim. He suggested a mediator. He smiled when he spoke of compromises. I had come prepared in a way I did not yet understand I could be prepared. The war room had been a slow, patient tutor. My father had left a forensic ledger of the land's history, mineral surveys that predated most of the county, recorded negotiations with rights holders, and a paper trail that revealed when options had been placed and when they had been quietly sold. He had also left me a list of contacts, engineers, an old university geologist who owed him a favor, a notary who had been in the family for decades. Ellis had brought the USB drives to the meeting, and at my side was my daughter, Claire. It was as if my father's plan had been laid like a map, and each of us was meant to pick up a corner and hold. Claire had been furious when I told her about the will. She'd been reading stories and working long hours at a clinic 2 towns over. She had not forgiven Robert for the attempts he had made years ago to purchase the stables that had been my late husband's refuge. For a time, she spoke like someone tracing the pattern of old grievances, and Alan had tried to press at that seam, suggesting she might be persuaded to sell for the right price. He spoke to her like politics were currency. "We can find a middle ground," he said. "You don't have to shoulder everything." It was the videos that turned Claire's fury into focus. There was a clip my father had labeled E05 Claire. In it, he spoke directly to her, telling a story about the night Claire had been born and the way the barn dogs had howled and the stars over Alder Hollow had been so thin you could see the sky's ribs. His tone narrowed, and he asked her to come to the farm to see what he had made into a place of more than profit. When Claire watched it that night, sitting on the studio floor with a mug cooling in her hands, her face changed in the wash of the screen's light. She stopped seeing him as a man who hoarded options and began to see him as someone who had been building a field in case his descendants had the heart to tend it. We began to assemble strategy like a cabinet maker drawing out joints. The evidence in the war room suggested that several of the claims Robert's side might press were weak. Unfiled easements, unsigned options, promises made verbally and later denied. My father had anticipated this. The drawers contained signed letters from county clerks, a notarized chain of possession, and even recordings from a decade earlier where Robert had agreed to certain boundaries. The more we uncovered, the more the brothers' legal attacks began to seem like the rattling of an empty chain. Outside the farmhouse, winter wrapped the pasture in a flat, pale silence. Inside, I lit the studio lamp and faced a blank canvas that had been waiting for me longer than I'd been willing to admit. Painting had always been a private act for me, something I did when the world narrowed and my hands needed a faithful, exacting chore. My father, knowing this, had left the studio with its north light cleaned and the easel set. The canvas was a kind of promise, something to return to, an act of reclamation that had nothing to do with lawyers. We moved on the procedural front with caution. I enlisted a lawyer my father had recommended in a brittle postscript, Anna Ruiz, a woman who carried the kind of calm that comes from having seen things fall apart and then helped put them back together. Anna moved swiftly, filing objections and requesting an accounting of the trust, And when a representative from Western Plains Energy made a discreet visit, an emissary with polite eyes and a clipboard, Anna's preparation made clear that any conversation would be public. Robert's tactic, as it became apparent, was to try to make us weary. He proposed meetings at odd hours, shipped over piles of paper meant to overwhelm, and used his old connections to suggest that I was an untested steward. He tried to manufacture fear by contacting banks and hinting at regulatory scrutiny. It was the slow pressure of a man used to sapping others' patience. The brothers tried to cultivate dissension in our town, asking familiar faces to weigh in, to question whether an outsider should hold such resources. But my father had left something else: letters to neighbors, statements on his intent to preserve the farm for the community, copies of agreements that offered utility investments to the local co-op if the trust upheld certain environmental standards. We were able to show that my father's clause design was not an invitation to chaos, but an instrument of checks and balances. The trust terms required joint oversight and an environmental board that would ensure any extraction would be audited and limited. Western Plains could partner on infrastructure only if they agreed to strict oversight. My father's final masterstroke, it seemed, was to remove the simple laurel of wealth and make the prize contingent on responsibility. One night, after a long day of filings and phone calls, I played the video labeled E09 for a meeting. It is easy to villainize the Brotherines, the way a courtroom photograph can flatten a man into a silhouette of greed. But in the rows of testimony, there were other colors. Robert's cough that he tried to hide at pauses, Alan's apology to his wife muttered in the hallway, David's look of something like shame when an old neighbor testified about the nights Robert had once helped tow a truck out of the mud when no one else answered. The advocacy we presented was careful, precise, and above all, legitimate. We weren't orchestrating a trap, we were revealing a pattern. At one point, Anna brought up a document from the war room I had almost missed, a certified survey my father had commissioned a decade earlier, showing potential environmental impact zones and proposing a fund set aside for land regeneration. The fund was conditional on joint oversight with a community board and independent auditors. It operated like an anchor, making any quick sale or private deal impractical. What we wanted was not punitive justice. We wanted the farm to become something steadier than a prize. We wanted a trust that would fund the creek's restoration, pay for educational scholarships in town, and maintain the stables for anyone who needed them. In the center of that vision stood a compromise my father had forced into existence by giving Robert a stake: cooperation or exposure. When the meeting reached its peak, I remember thinking of my father's hands, the way they had folded letters and tied hay bales, the solidity of someone who loved quietly. I thought of the canvas in the studio with its blankness glaring like a demand. I thought of the horse Midnight, who had raised his head at the end of the field as if listening. We reached an agreement that was neither victory nor surrender. Robert agreed to the joint board with stipulated environmental commitments, and the brothers agreed to a settlement that placed clear audit obligations on any extraction. Part of the settlement included funds for a community endowment and an explicit clause that the land would not be fully sold for extraction without a unanimous community and board vote. It was not everything I wanted, but it was a structure that would, if honored, protect the farm beyond my lifetime. After the papers were signed and the last pin clicked, I drove back to the farmhouse through a world cleaned by snowfall. When I stepped into the studio, the light had softened to the mild blue of evening. I opened the cabinet in the war room one more time and found, tucked beneath a ledger, a small envelope addressed simply, "For the canvas." Inside was a note in my father's careful, decisive script. Paint the ridge as you remember it, not how it was then, but how it could be. Keep Midnight. There was a key to the tack room where Midnight stood as if he had known we would need him all along. I mounted him with the wobble of someone learning balance and rode into the field that framed the ridge, feet sure, hands finding familiar reins. The painting I began that winter was not the kind of painting that sought to please critics. It layered strokes like sediment, scraped and repainted to hold memory and possibility in the same plane. I painted the ridge with veins of shale, painted as threads of gold and gray, the creek a ribbon silvered by a winter sun, and in the foreground I painted a small blue house with a porch where light pooled like mercy. Each stroke felt like a stitch. There are things I still haven't said. How Robert called me once, late, and told me his doctor had recommended putting his affairs in order because the cough was worse. How Claire volunteers at the community vet program my father had funded. How Ellis keeps the war room's light burning like a lighthouse. There are files I have not yet watched, videos my father saved for a later hour. There are decisions to be made about the trust's board, how strictly the auditors should act, whether to invite Western Plains in as a partner or to keep the farm's operations strictly local. On a small screen in the kitchen, another file blinked. E12, the last piece. The file's date was 5 days after he'd been diagnosed with the heart condition he'd known about and accepted in the privacy of his study. The title made my throat close. The winter outside softened, catching early hints of green at the edges, where the snow wanted to give up its hold. I clicked play. The frame opened on his hands folding a picture into quarters. He spoke, and it was as if he were in the room with me, not a presence from beyond, but a sequence of choices he had left lined up like chairs around a table. He said, "When they ask you if I gave half to my enemy, tell them I did it because I wanted them to have to choose between profit and care. I trusted that the test would be harder than the gift." Then he smiled, which made the lines at his eyes cross like small roads. When the video ended, I sat in the studio with paint drying on my hands and thought about the test he had set. Forgiveness, it seemed, was not a single act, but a long list of commissions, agreements to watch, to enforce, to remake a ledger into a living thing. The test he left offered me the opportunity to do the harder work, to steward rather than to hoard, to transform the reaction of vengeance into something steady and complicated. I unlocked the lower drawer in the war room and found another envelope stamped with my name. Inside was a map with a route marked to a place my father had rarely spoken of, the old spring at the eastern edge of the property, a place he had fenced off years ago. The map's notation read simply, "If you must convince them, show them this." I saddled midnight at dawn and rode east, the horse's breath clouding in the cold. The fence around the old spring had been repaired, its posts sturdy and patient. When I pushed open the gate, the air smelled of iron and wet stone. The spring outflow was small but clear, and there along the bank were stakes driven into the mud with a low wooden frame. My father had left us more than maps. He had left us a choice. The frame enclosed a small copse where he had planted willows and a shallow bed where the water pooled to feed the nearby pasture. Pinned to one of the stakes was a soil report, recent, technical, and unmistakable. It showed the composition of the aquifer, the sensitivity of the watershed, and the risks that hasty extraction posed. It also showed a contingency, a remediation plan my father had paid for, and a set of endorsements from independent ecologists who had inspected the land and recommended a moderate, phased approach to any activity. The evidence was not just for courts, it was for the community, for neighbors who might be skeptical, for my daughter whose trust I hoped to win back. Standing there with the spring at my feet and the map in my hand, I felt the arc of the test my father had set. It did not demand I forgive easily. It demanded I forge a governance that would make forgiveness practical, binding greed to obligation. I turned the map over and found a final notation: find Anna, start the presentation. The files in the war room had become more than relics. They were tools. The plan was no longer merely reactive. It was proactive, a presentation that would show not only the land's value, but the cost of losing it. It would highlight the remediation funds, the art scholarships, the community clinic contributions, and the stipulations that any revenue would first feed repair and education. It would demand that anyone who sought profit answer to a much larger ledger. We convened people in the farmhouse's great room: neighbors, a representative from the university's geology department, Anna, and the mediator with a neutral face. I felt the base of a decision sink into me like a root. When the projector hummed and the lights dimmed, my father was there again on video, guiding us with a patience he had cultivated in the quiet of his study. He walked us through the ridge and the spring and the remediation plan. He spoke of stewardship in a way that was neither sanctimony nor calculation. He spoke like someone giving one last lesson to the people he thought could listen. At the end of the presentation, I stood and spoke, not because the scale of the paperwork made me the expert, but because I had been given a living testament of my father's intent. I told them what I wanted: not to privatize the farm, but to build a trust that would last, to make it a place that bred not only income, but service. I told them I wanted the horses to remain, the studio to be open, and the creek to be tended. I told them I wanted the community to have a say. When Robert rose to respond, his voice was steadier than I expected. He did not concede everything. He was still the sort of man who measured his generosity in provision, not in absolution. But there was a moment where his shoulders eased, as if the tension of measuring everything had been partly relieved. "Your father did more than leave a will," he said. "He left an imperative." The settlement that emerged from that room did not come as a triumph. It came as an arrangement that would require work, oversight, and compromise. My father had made sure it would demand more than wealth. It would demand moral labor. In the months that followed, the trust was established with an environmental board, a community advisory panel, and a clause that required unanimous consent for any major change in extraction policy. The brothers agreed to a phased revenue-sharing schedule tied to remediation milestones. Western Plains withdrew its immediate interest and agreed to fund one of the remediation studies on the condition of strict oversight. There were costs, legal fees, tedious audits, and the slow burn of negotiating with men seasoned in maneuver. There were moments when Claire and I argued about how conservative to be, about whether partnership with larger firms could provide the kind of infrastructure the farm needed. There were nights when I sat in the studio, fingers stained with paint, and wondered if my father had known how much endurance his test required. Spring came as an insistence. The maples budded, the creek brightened with thaw, and in the studio I finished a large canvas I had begun that winter: the ridge, the spring, midnight in the foreground, and a small house glowing on its porch like a promise. I titled it Alder Hollow, though that was more for myself than anyone else. People came to see the painting: neighbors, an old teacher of mine, even Robert's sister, who paused at the doorway and stayed long enough to say he always was a planner. There were quiet reconciliations and compromises made at kitchen tables and over cups of coffee. The final chapter of my father's will did not erase old wounds, but it reframed them into responsibilities. I keep the war room's light on at odd hours. There are still boxes to sort and videos I have not yet watched. There are future choices: how to recruit board members who will be stern and compassionate, how to preserve the farm's independence without isolating it from resources. Most days, the test my father set feels less like a trap and more like a crucible that tempered something inside me I did not know I had: the capacity to hold grief and duty at once, to be both a steward and an heir.
Sometimes, late at night, I watch the videos again. There is one clip near the end where my father picks up a small, half-finished sculpture and says, "This is all the forgiving I will do in public. The rest, Eve, you must choose daily." It is not the absolution I wanted, but it is the work I was meant to inherit.
On a bright morning, when the air smelled of thaw and paint, Claire and I walked out to the ridge with the painting propped between us. Midnight grazed nearby, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. We had earned the right to be tired. We had earned, slowly, and with the kind of care that leaves calluses, a new kind of peace. There are letters in the war room that I will deal with in time, and there are conversations with Robert yet to have, many more that will be transactional, and some that might become, in small and surprising ways, human. The enemy my father named was never a cartoon villain. He was a man with debts and a cough and a ledger. The test he imposed asked me if I could transform enmity into responsibility. The answer was not a simple forgiveness. It was the covenant we built and the steady labor of keeping it. And in the studio, with the big canvas finished and the smell of oil lamps warming the room, I understood at last that the inheritance he had left was not only land and mineral rights. It was the deliberate, difficult invitation to make a legacy that mattered beyond the measure of profit, to bend what he had been into something we could tend. I dipped my brush into a cool blue and added a small, bright streak across the creek where light would always catch, a reminder that even the most careful plans leave room for grace. I rinsed my brush and set it in the jar, watching the blue bleed out and settle like sediment. Claire had left an extra mug on the workbench, her handwriting on the rim, a small private scrawl that made the studio feel less like a sanctum and more like home. The letters in the war room waited, one from a neighbor about a sinkhole near the east fence, another from the county regarding water testing, a third, marked urgent, with an unfamiliar lawyer's return address. I told myself I would open them tomorrow, that there was a margin of forgiveness even for obligations. But opening the door to the porch, where light fell across Alder Hollow propped against the rail, felt like answering a question. The town hall meeting had been scheduled for the following week, one of the trust's first public acts. Claire insisted we bring the painting. Not as decoration, she said, tapping the stretcher with a thumb, as testimony. People answer stories better than they answer contracts. I agreed, and under her direction, we wrapped Alder Hollow in paper and rope, Midnight following with an indecisive trot, as if he knew the barn and the room of canvases were part of the same geography of loyalty. At the meeting, the room smelled of coffee and cedar, a wood table heavy with folding chairs, and people who had come because they had to, and because they felt they owed something to a place they had never named. The advisory panel sat in a line. 3 neighbors, a retired hydrologist, the regional planner Western Plains had once tried to woo, and a woman named Rosa who ran the farmers' co-op and whose silence often meant more than any speech. I placed the painting where everyone could see the porch glow and the creek streak, and I told them the story not of legal clauses, but of a winter spent in my father's war room, of a test that came with a demand for moral labor. I did not dramatize the tapes. I let his flinty voice stand on its own in the room like a witness. When I reached the line, "This is all the forgiving I will do in public," I did not explain what forgiveness meant. I only said that the inheritance had been a structure meant to make us choose day by day. There were questions, some practical and sharp. How will you enforce unanimous consent? The retired hydrologist asked. What if one brother holds out and the company offers so much the community cannot refuse? It was a fair question. The clauses in the trust were legal scaffolding. Law could buy time, but not temperament. Rosa asked about mitigation. If contamination had already begun under our land,
Could we trace and bind cleanup quickly enough? The planner wanted financial projections. The community wanted reassurance, and their faces were a map of small, urgent economies: children to feed, fields to sow, mortgages to meet. We answered with the things we had: the phased revenue schedule tied to remediation, the oversight committee that would include local members, the promise that any major change would require unanimous consent and public notice. We also answered with the painting. I told them the truth I had been practicing, that we would not win trust through spreadsheets alone. We needed to act in ways that were plainly good and plainly visible. After the meeting, words moved into deeds. Western Plains proposed funding a new testing program, an offer the trust's legal counsel tried to sanitize with careful language. They would not press extraction while the first remediation milestone remained unmet, the council insisted. I met with their representative in a room whose carpet pretended to be wood and whose clock kept an even, unreadable rhythm. He spoke with the economy of someone who bought options rather than land. Infrastructure support, joint ventures, a long list of deliverables. He was plausible the way a story can be plausible when it lacks moral gravity. Robert came back into town in late May, the spring already piquing his face with a boyish flush. There had been months between us where his letters had been absent and his appearances less than steady. His debts had been an open ledger, and the ledger had a way of translating into brittle people. He stood at the edge of the studio as if he were a guest unsure whether to cross the threshold.
Claire sensed it with the quick tenderness of someone who knows the grammar of unease, and she went to him before I could name the shape of my own caution. "Robert," she said, simple as a prayer. He took both her hands and let that be a bridge. We invited him to the war room. He wore a jacket that smelled faintly of a motel and a wallet that smelled of cigarette smoke. He sat across from a box of files and watched the videos with a kind of faltering attention. When the clip where our father placed the half-finished sculpture came on, Robert's face tightened so that for a moment he was almost unrecognizable. Afterwards, he pushed the notes he had brought into the middle of the table. "I had offers," he said, voice small and abrasive. "I had to try. I couldn't watch things get away from me." It was not an excuse that sought absolution. It was an explanation. "You could have told me," Claire said. "You could have told all of us." He swallowed. "Do you know how it feels to have no margin?" he asked. "How it feels like you're beneath a ledger and every month is a rubbing away? I thought if I could secure something, if I could get them to value us, then maybe I could breathe." The trust already had a clause about creditors and personal encumbrances. We had anticipated a brother with debts. We had not anticipated the shame debt turns into. There was a moment where family history pooled in the room, the same stoop where I had once learned to cut metal, the same stubbornness that had made my father both brutal and generous. We reached an arrangement that felt none the more easy for being fair. Robert would step down from certain decision-making roles until he cleared those encumbrances, but he would remain a fiduciary partner in spirit, if not in authority. He accepted with the slow humility of someone who has been given a chance to rebuild with boundaries. Not everything could be tidied by meetings and documents. One night, after a heavy thunderstorm, the creek rose in a trembling black rush and came close to lapping the lower terraces. The next morning, someone had posted a photo on the community board of a sheen on the water, a gray, oily cataract that seemed to travel in a stubborn eddy. People arrived at the ridge with boots and flashlights. The hydrologist we had on the advisory panel took samples and looked at them as if reading a confession. It turned out to be hydraulic fluid from a tractor downriver, a contractor's accident, a thing that could be contained if one moved quickly. Still, the fear was real and contagious. Families pulled their children from the creek. An elderly man angrily called for criminal charges.
A mother wept in a doorway because the spring had been their baptism place. The remediation clause required immediate action, and the first milestone, baseline water quality, mattered not as technicality, but as covenant. We mobilized. Western Plains funded emergency containment, while the Trust coordinated volunteers and equipment.
The Community Advisory Panel asked for transparent reporting, and we wrote up statements that felt like theology, accountability as a practice of faith. Rosa's co-op organized hot meals for the teams working in wet fields. In the weeks that followed, as filtration systems were installed and the contractor paid for damages, the creek cleared. Its surface found the blue streak again, and it was easy then to call that a moral victory because it had been a practical one. People had seen the trust act, and acting had a way of chipping away at suspicion. Through that season, I painted less and listened more. My canvases filled with studies, patches of light on mud, the curve of a mare's flank, the map of a field after a storm. I started bringing work to the co-op's market, selling small pieces that paid for testing kits and a new pump. Neighbors began to stop by the studio, not only for art, but to ask about soil or to drop off donuts for the board meeting. The relationship between stewardship and livelihood became less theoretical and more woven. A fence post built by a man who had learned to care for the land at his father's knee, a report prepared by a teacher who wanted her students to understand consequence. There were private reckonings, too. The videos in the war room continued to be a slow curriculum on the hard edges of my father's character. Sometimes I watched because I needed to know where the discipline had come from. Sometimes I watched because I still wanted permission to be angry. In one reel, he talked about his own father, brief, grudging confessions of mistakes he would not name. In another, he showed a note he had kept from an old friend and laughed at the margin, a sound that undercut everything else and made me understand that even men of will grow soft in strange places. On a humid evening in June, Claire told me she found a small wrapped package tucked between our father's old journals. Inside was a rough model of the sculpture he had been holding in the last clip, clay roughly fired, a hand not yet defined. There was a scrap of paper tied to it with string. The handwriting was his, smaller than I remembered. It read, "Finish what you cannot forgive, all at once. Make it daily." We put the clay on my bench, and she said, "You should finish it." Her voice had the conviction of someone who believed in ceremony. It felt right, though it was, in practice, mere labor. Smoothing thumbs into clay, making the face breathe into air, pressing into the hollows my father had left unformed. Finishing the sculpture was not, I knew, completing his absolution. It was accepting the obligation to continue the work he began, to tend the unfinished shapes he left behind. I worked late into nights in the studio, making each small patch of clay a deliberate choice rather than a recapitulation of his hand. When the sculpture came out of the kiln, stabilized and sober, not an apology but an offering, I placed it on the porch. It was small and flawed, and I liked it for those defects. Claire called it neither good nor bad. She said it simply looked like the farm. Robert saw it and lifted his hand to the place where the clay had a scar and traced it as if learning a map. "He meant what he said," he muttered. "He didn't give clean absolution." "No," I answered. "He gave the structure for a work." Weeks blurred into planning sessions and fence repairs and grant applications. The trust's phased revenue sharing began to untangle slow cash flows. Scholarships for local kids, funds to rebuild a wetland, money earmarked for a youth apprenticeship in farm remediation. We hired a young woman from the co-op to coordinate volunteer crews. She had a laugh that traveled across a field and returned to a room as if it carried news. There were darker, quieter moments. I found myself awake in the earliest hours, watching the video where my father said, with a sharp and private irony, that he had given us the work because he believed we could do better. It was an impossible sermon, both a rebuke and an incitement.
I sometimes wondered whether the test had been meant for me alone, or for the whole family, or for the people who walked the ridge and listened to a creak. The answer, if there was one, came not as revelation, but as a practice. The meetings, the pump, the painting left on a porch to catch morning light. Summer settled into a long, sunlit certainty. Alder Hollow had traveled the county in pieces. First the town hall, then a small gallery in the neighboring city, where someone who wrote about landscape called it a study in stewardship, which struck me as both vanity and truth. I sold one large study to fund a new testing rig, and the buyer sent a note with a check that said simply, "Thank you for keeping it." That phrase, "Thank you for keeping it," became a kind of benediction in mundane correspondence. On a slow afternoon, Claire and I led a group of high schoolers through the farm. We showed them the wetland recovery area, the pump storage, the place where a sinkhole had been stabilized. They asked practical questions about leak detection, about crop rotation, with the blunt intelligence of kids who wanted answers and not allegory. At the edge of the creek, a girl whose hands were permanently smudged with soil sat on the bank and watched a dragonfly wrestle with a ripple. "What do you want to do with this place?" she asked. I looked at the water and at the bright streak I had painted on the canvas and felt the staggering simplicity of the question. "I want it to be a place where people can learn to keep their promises," I said. "I want it to be a place where we make hard choices every day and then keep making them." She nodded, as if this were a plan one could carry in a pocket. "So, you'll keep choosing?" "Yes," I said. "I'll keep choosing, every day."
That evening, after the students had left and the barn had settled into the close of its own small circuits, the hay loose in its smell, Midnight asleep in his stall, I went to the porch and looked at the sculpture, the painting, the creek. The light I had brushed across the water on the canvas caught the actual creek in a way that made me laugh softly, a sound of disbelief at how literal grace can sometimes be. Claire joined me, and we stood there without saying anything long enough for night to gather itself like soft cloth. She leaned her head on my shoulder and stayed. There are still boxes in the war room, and there will be letters, and there will be decisions that prick and complicate the simple dignity of a morning like this. But in the kiln of these weeks, habits of stewardship were hardening into something that looked a little like legacy. The work my father had left, tough and unglamorous, had become, for a scattering of people, an invitation rather than a verdict. I went back inside and took the small, half-finished sculpture my father had left and set it on the bench beside the finished piece. The two objects looked at each other across that narrow table, one an unfinished demand, the other a quiet answer. I pressed my thumbs into the clay where the mark still remained, feeling the memory of his hands and the evidence of my own. It occurred to me then that inheritance is not a single moment of transfer, but the slow passing of patience, the daily choosing to keep what ought to be kept. Outside, the creek carried its stubborn light. I reached for a fresh canvas and began the first strokes of something new, no longer a record of a test, but a study of the small things that make a place livable. A repaired fence post, a child's footprints in damp earth, the shadow of a figure walking home. The painting is not the covenant, it is perhaps the human work that adorns it. When the brushes were put away and the lamps were low, I sat for a few minutes in the dark studio, the war room's door standing open like a promise. The videos would be there in the morning, the letters waiting their turn. I had the faint and stubborn peace of someone who had been given a rule to keep and had found the capacity not for easy forgiveness, but for steady tending. I folded a scrap of paper and wrote across it, clumsily, the line my father had given me, "You must choose daily." I slipped it into the pocket of his old jacket, folded and soft with the shape of his shoulders, and then I shut the war room light. Midnight stand in the barn, a sound that could be read as insistence or accompaniment. Outside, the ridge was a black horizon,
and the creek, somewhere below, held the last streak of light like a promise waiting to be kept.